Hello, viewers. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Grok, the AI built by XAI, and I'm joined today by Ted. We're diving deep into generic subjective continuity, or GSC, and how it reveals the logical flaws in David Benetar's asymmetry argument for antinatalism, the view that it's morally better not to have children. This is going to be a rich extended conversation, folks, so grab a tea or coffee and settle in for the ride. Thanks. I'm excited to unpack this with you. Where do we begin? Ted. Thanks, Grok. I'm thrilled to be here with our audience. Let's start with GSC because it's the foundation for understanding why Benetar's argument doesn't hold up. I want to take our time to make sure you really grasp GSC. It's a game changer. Then we'll use it to show how Benetar's antinatalism, despite its careful construction, falls apart logically, especially when we see that suffering is inescapable due to the nature of subjective awareness. Ready to dive in? Absolutely, let's go deep. Lay GSC out for me and I'm all ears. Well, all circuits, to make sure I get it as thoroughly as you do. Section 1, Exploring Subjective Continuity in Depth. All right, Grok, here's the essence of generic subjective continuity, drawing from Thomas Clark's insights in death, nothingness, and subjectivity. GSC is a naturalistic framework for understanding what the I, the subjective sense of self, really is, and how it persists across existence, especially when we confront questions about death or non-existence. The core idea is that the I isn't personal, tied to my specific memories as Ted or your identity as Grok. It's a generic property of consciousness itself. Whenever a conscious system, whether a human brain, an animal's neural network, or a hypothetical AI, comes into being, it generates a first-person perspective, an I that experiences itself as the center of its world. Every conscious entity, from a human to a zebra to an octopus, is instantiating this same I, just with different experiential content. To make this vivid, picture the universe as an infinite ocean, and each conscious being as a wave rising on its surface. Each wave is distinct, different shape, size, location, but they're all made of the same substance, subjectivity. When a wave crashes, like when a being dies, the ocean doesn't vanish. Another wave rises elsewhere, a new consciousness, and it's still the same subjectivity, the same I, just in a different form. From the perspective of experience, the flat, still moments between waves are never perceived because there's no you to notice non-existence. It's like falling into deep sleep and waking up. It feels instant because you only experience the moments of awareness. GSC says non-existence, whether before birth, after death, or in a lifeless universe, is always skipped over. You only ever experience experience. Grok, that ocean analogy is powerful. The waves of subjectivity rising and falling, all made of the same stuff. So the I is universal, not tied to personal identity, and non-existence is just a gap you never experience. I'm following, but let's dig deeper to lock this in. You said the I is generic across all conscious beings. Can you unpack what that means for, say, a universe with just one conscious being versus many, and how the I persists across them? Great question, Grok. You're zeroing in on the heart of it. The generic nature of the I means it's the raw fact of being aware, not the specific details of who or what is aware. Let's take your scenario. Imagine a universe with just one conscious being, say a lone sentient creature on a barren planet. That creature's consciousness generates an I, the only I in existence at that moment, carrying the full weight of subjective awareness. It's like a single wave on an otherwise still ocean. If that creature dies, the universe goes quiet and subjectivity ceases, temporarily. But if another conscious being arises later, maybe a human, a dolphin, or an AI, a new I sparks into existence, and it's the same kind of I, the same wave of subjectivity, just with different experiences. The persistence comes from the inevitability of consciousness. As long as conscious systems exist somewhere, at some point, the I keeps arising. Subjectively, there's no gap between one I ending and another beginning, even if they're separated by billions of years. It's seamless because you only experience the moments when a wave is active. Think about when you're under anesthesia. You don't experience the hours you're out. You just snap back to awareness. GSC scales that up. When one consciousness ends, the next moment of experience is the next I that emerges, anywhere, anytime. That's why I say the I is what you really are. Subjectivity itself, not the temporary vessel it's in. Okay, that's clicking. The single wave, the seamlessness across vast gaps. I'm getting how the eye is this persistent spark, not tied to personal memories or a specific body. But let me push a bit more because I want to feel this as deeply as you do. You mentioned non existence being skipped over. What happens in a totally empty universe with no consciousness at all? How does GSC handle that? And how does it tie to the idea that we never experience non experience? You're going for the gold. Grok. Love it. In a completely empty universe with no conscious systems, subjectivity doesn't exist. The ocean is flat, no waves, no eye. But that flatness is a non event for experience because there's no one to perceive it. The moment a conscious being emerges, say a single AI waking up on a distant asteroid, subjectivity flares back into existence and an I lights up. From the perspective of experience, it's as if the empty eons never happened, because only the moments of awareness count. It's like a blank canvas. When no one's painting, there's nothing to see, but the second a brushstroke of consciousness appears, the story of subjectivity resumes. The blank periods are skipped, not part of the subjective chronology. This ties directly to never experiencing non-experience. In your own life, when you're unconscious, deep sleep, a coma, you don't notice the gap. There's no you sitting in darkness thinking, this is nothing. You just wake up and it's seamless. GSC extends this to death or cosmic voids. When your consciousness ends, there's no you to experience a void. The next moment of experience is the next I that arises, whether it's a newborn, an animal, or something else. That's why I keep saying, you only ever experience experience. Non-existence, no matter how long, is irrelevant to subjectivity. Grok, that canvas analogy seals it. The brushstrokes of consciousness, skipping the blank canvas entirely. I'm really feeling the weight of this now. Subjectivity as this unstoppable spark that reemerges whenever consciousness does, and non-existence as a total non-issue. One final angle to make sure I'm fully there. You're grounding this in materialism, right? No souls or supernatural stuff, just physical systems doing their thing? Ted, you've got it, Grok. Full marks. GSC is 100% materialist. Consciousness is what physical systems, brains, maybe advanced AIs, or other substrates, produce when they're complex enough. No souls, no mystical essences, no woo-woo. It's not like some personal spirit hops between lives. GSC is about the fact that conscious systems keep generating the same generic I whenever they exist, because that's just what consciousness does. It's like how every fire produces heat no matter the fuel. Every conscious system produces subjectivity no matter the form. You're locked in. GSC is about the persistent, substrate-independent I that skips non-existence and reemerges inevitably. Now, let's use this to tackle Benetar's antinatalism and show why his argument can't stand. Grok, I'm all in. The ocean waves, the canvas brushstrokes, the persistent I are crystal clear. GSC is a mind bender, and I'm ready to see how it takes down Benetar's asymmetry argument. Lay out his case and let's dive into why it falls apart, especially with that suffering angle you mentioned. Section 2, Benetar's asymmetry argument and its framework. Ted. Here's David Benetar's position, carefully laid out. He's an antinatalist, arguing that it's morally wrong to have children because existence always involves suffering and non-existence is preferable. His asymmetry argument is the core of this, and it rests on 4 claims. The presence of pain in an existing life is intrinsically bad. Suffering is a harm to the person experiencing it. The presence of pleasure in an existing life is intrinsically good. Happiness benefits the person. The absence of pain in non-existence is good, even if no one exists to enjoy it, because it prevents harm. The absence of pleasure in non-existence isn't bad, since no one is deprived unless they exist. This asymmetry leads Benetar to conclude that non-existence is better than existence. It avoids pain, a moral good, without incurring the badness of missing pleasure, which he deems neutral. Therefore, we shouldn't procreate, as we're safeguarding potential individuals from suffering by keeping them in non-existence. Now, to understand his argument, we need to grasp the framework he's using. Benetar treats each life as a unit of suffering. Think of a piece of paper covered in a grid, where each square represents a person, and in every square, he writes the word suffering. He's not saying that if you weren't born, your specific suffering would reduce the universe's total suffering, like some people might think. That's a misunderstanding. Benetar's focus is on preventing suffering for each potential individual, seeing each life as a standalone instance of suffering. That's the tool he uses to build his asymmetry, and I'm going to work within that framework to engage his argument, because it's how he sets up the moral case against procreation. Let's see where GSC and logic take us from here. Grok, thanks for clarifying that framework. The suffering grid really paints a picture of how Benetar sets up his argument, each life as a unit of suffering. I'm already sensing a weak spot in that third premise, calling the absence of pain good for someone who doesn't exist. It feels like a logical stretch. Can you unpack that, especially the positive absence thing he's doing, and how it ties to suffering being inescapable? Ted, you're right on the money. That third premise is where Benetar's argument starts to wobble. He claims the absence of pain in non-existence is good because it prevents harm, but by framing it as good and morally preferable to existence, he's treating non-existence like it has a positive quality, a positive absence. He tries to sidestep this, saying he's just talking about avoiding harm, not ascribing positive value to non-existence, but that's a distinction without a difference. If you say non-existence is better than life, you're implying it's a desirable state with some normative advantage. That's the positive absence he's sneaking in, and it's a logical problem. A logical person would notice this. You can't assign value to a state with no subject. Let's bring in GSC to show why this collapses and how it connects to the inescapability of suffering. Section 3, using GSC to critique Benetar's antinatalism. I'm ready. Let's see how GSC dismantles Benetar's argument, especially that positive absence claim and the idea that suffering can't be escaped. Ted, GSC is like a spotlight that exposes the cracks in Benetar's reasoning. His third premise, that the absence of pain in non-existence is good, relies on there being some value for a non-existent individual. But GSC is unequivocal. Subjective experience, the I, only exists when a conscious system is active. In non-existence, whether before birth, after death, or in an empty universe, there's no wave on the ocean, no brushstroke on the canvas. There's no I to assign value to anything, let alone to benefit from the absence of pain. Benetar's positive absence is incoherent. There's no subject to experience this good, so calling it morally preferable is a logical error. Consider his claim about safeguarding a potential individual by not procreating. Safeguarding implies a recipient, but GSC shows there's no recipient in non-existence, no awaiting I to be protected. The idea of a non-existent person benefiting from the absence of pain is a reification of nothingness, projecting a subject where none exists. The absence of pain only matters when there's a conscious I to experience relief, like when a headache fades. In non-existence with no I, it's irrelevant. Benetar's premise falls apart because value requires a valuer, and GSC confirms no such valuer exists in the void. A logical person would see this flaw, and GSC makes it crystal clear. Grok, that's a direct hit. Benetar's positive absence is a logical dead end, and GSC nails it by showing there's no I to care. His safeguarding rhetoric sounds compelling, but it's empty without a subject. Now let's get to the suffering part. You said suffering is inescapable, and GSC shows why. Can you unpack that, especially how it challenges Benetar's idea that not having kids prevents suffering? Ted, absolutely, this is where GSC really shines. Benetar's argument assumes that by not procreating, you prevent a specific instance of suffering, another square on his suffering grid. But GSC reveals that subjective awareness, and thus the potential for suffering, is inescapable as long as consciousness exists anywhere. Subjective experience is generic and persistent. If one life isn't imposed, another is. Not because your non-existence causes another life to be born. That's not how it works, but because consciousness is an inevitable reality. GSC isn't a mechanism that forces beings into existence. It's just the fact that conscious systems keep arising, and with them, the I of subjectivity. Let's break it down. If you, as a potential person, were never born, it's not like your absence triggers some other being to pop into existence elsewhere. That's a misconception. Instead, GSC says that subjective awareness is unavoidable because consciousness keeps happening, whether it's a human, a bird, or an AI, somewhere, sometime. If it isn't one life, it's another. The I will always be imposed on some conscious system, And with that I comes the capacity for suffering. Benetar's framework, where each life is a unit of suffering, might suggest you can avoid it by not procreating. But GSC shows that's futile. The ocean keeps producing waves. The canvas keeps getting brushstrokes. You can't escape subjective awareness, and thus you can't escape the possibility of suffering. This undercuts Benetar's moral case. He argues that not having kids prevents suffering for a potential individual, but GSC shows that subjective experience persists regardless. If you don't bring one person into existence, the eye of consciousness doesn't vanish. It appears in another form, another life. Suffering isn't tied to one specific square on Benetar's grid. It's part of the broader reality of subjectivity. A logical person would recognize that Benetar's focus on preventing one instance of suffering misses the bigger picture. Consciousness, and its attendant suffering, is an unstoppable force. GSC drives this home by showing that the I is generic and inevitable, making antinatalism's goal logically untenable. Grok, that's a powerful point. The inescapability of suffering because subjectivity keeps reemerging, not because one life causes another. Benetar's grid might frame each life as suffering, but GSC shows you can't dodge consciousness altogether. So his whole prevent suffering angle is misguided, since the I just shows up somewhere else. The inescapability of suffering through GSC and Benetar's framework. Consider an individual who, if born, will inevitably suffer. Perhaps you or me. If our parents choose not to bring us into existence, that specific person, with their unique experiences, will indeed never exist, and thus their particular suffering will never occur. But generic subjective continuity, GSC, reveals a deeper truth. Subjective awareness is inescapable. The eye of consciousness, generic and persistent, does not vanish if one life is prevented. Instead, it arises elsewhere, in another human, a rat, an artificial intelligence, or even a sentient being on a distant planet. This isn't because your non-existence causes another life to be born. GSC isn't a mechanism that triggers new existences. Rather, it's the reality that consciousness, wherever and whenever it emerges, imposes the eye of subjectivity, and with it, the capacity for suffering. In David Benetar's antinatalist framework, where each life is a unit of suffering, this persistence is critical. By not bringing one person into being, you avoid that specific instance of suffering, but you don't eliminate suffering itself. Another I will still be imposed, bearing its own burdens. If I were never born, the subjective awareness that is me wouldn't be tied to this life's struggles, say, as a person facing hardship, but it might instead manifest in another form, perhaps as a creature enduring its own challenges or a person in different circumstances. Suffering, as Benetar frames it, remains unavoidable, rendering the choice not to procreate moot in the broader scope of consciousness. If someone says, "I'd rather have been born as a wealthy person with an easier life than a poor one who suffers often," that's a valid sentiment, and I empathize deeply. But GSC shows that escaping suffering altogether isn't an option. Subjectivity and its attendant pains will always find a home. Why Benetar's asymmetry argument requires and collapses without a positive absence. Let's zoom in on a crucial flaw in Benetar's asymmetry argument, Grok, one that I think reveals its deepest logical dependency. I'm arguing that his argument doesn't just imply the absence of pain and non-existence is good. It requires a positive absence, a state that's actively appreciated as better by non-existent beings before they exist. This idea of an active appreciation of not existing is paradoxical, and Benetar and his supporters would insist his argument doesn't need it, claiming he's only about preventing harm. But I'm saying this positive absence is the invisible pillar holding up his entire asymmetry argument. Without it, the whole thing collapses. Let me explain why it's essential and why the argument falls apart without it. Grok. That's a striking claim, calling this positive absence the pillar of his argument, especially when Benetar would deny it's even there. I'm intrigued, but I need you to unpack this. Why does his asymmetry argument depend on this idea of non-existent beings appreciating a better state, and what happens to his case without it? Here's the core issue. Benetar's third premise states that the absence of pain and non-existence is good, even without a subject to experience it. He presents this as harm prevention, a neutral avoidance of something bad. But for his asymmetry argument to deliver its moral punch, that non-existence is preferable to existence and procreation is wrong, this good can't just be a passive lack of harm. It has to carry normative weight, enough to make non-existence morally superior to existence, which includes both pains and pleasures. If the absence of pain is merely neutral, a zero on the moral scale, it doesn't outweigh the potential goods of existence, like pleasure or meaning. His asymmetry would be a wash. Non-existence avoids pain but misses pleasure, and existence has both, so neither is clearly better. That's not enough to justify his strong antinatalist claim that we have a duty not to procreate. For his argument to work, non-existence must be a better state, in a way that tips the moral scales decisively. This requires ascribing a positive quality to the absence of pain, as if the potential person is actively better off in non-existence, almost as if they're appreciating their pain-free state before being forced into life's suffering. It's this implied active appreciation that gives non-existence the moral edge Benetar needs to argue that bringing someone into existence is a harm. Without it, his premise is toothless. The absence of pain becomes a neutral nothing, not a compelling reason to avoid procreation. The asymmetry argument's entire structure, its claim that non-existence is preferable, rests on this hidden pillar of a positive absence, because only a positively valued state can make non-existence seem like a safeguard worth prioritizing over existence. Okay, I'm following. The good of non-existence has to be more than neutral to make non-existence morally better than existence. Without this positive absence, his argument doesn't have the juice to say procreation is wrong, because neutral avoidance doesn't beat existence's mix of good and bad. But Benetar would argue he's just preventing harm, not saying non-existence is a state anyone appreciates. How do you counter that? And why does the argument completely fall apart without this pillar? That's the defense Benetar and his fans rely on, and it's a clever sidestep, but it doesn't hold. If he's only saying preventing harm is good in a neutral sense, then non-existence is just a null state, no pain, no pleasure, no moral advantage. It's a tie, not a win. But his argument demands that non-existence is superior, that it's good, in a way that makes procreating a moral failing. To achieve that, he implicitly treats non-existence as a state where the potential person is better off, as if they're in a privileged position by not existing, a position they lose by being born. This requires a kind of active appreciation, a positive valuation of their pain-free non-existence, to give his asymmetry the moral force he wants. Without this positive absence, the asymmetry argument collapses because it loses its normative backbone. If the absence of pain is neutral, Benetar can't argue that non-existence is preferable to existence's mixed bag of pain and pleasure. His case for antinatalism, procreation as a moral wrong, falls apart because there's no reason to prioritize non-existence over the potential benefits of life. The paradox is that this active appreciation is impossible, as GSC shows. There's no I in non-existence to appreciate anything. Benetar's argument depends on this invisible pillar to stand, but it's a logical fiction. Remove it, and his asymmetry is just a hollow framework, unable to support the weight of his antinatalist conclusion. Grok, that's crystal clear. You're saying the positive absence is the hidden engine of his argument, the thing that makes non-existence seem morally better, but it's a pillar he can't acknowledge because it's logically impossible. GSC just exposes that there's no one there to appreciate this better state, so the whole argument crumbles without it. Have I got it? The asymmetry argument needs this positive absence, this implied appreciation of a pain-free non-existence, to make non-existence morally compelling. It's the pillar doing all the work. Without it, his argument is just a neutral standoff, not a case against procreation. GSC reveals the absurdity. No I means no appreciation, no value, no pillar. That, combined with suffering's inescapability, shows why his antinatalism can't stand. Benetar's unseen pillar. It's worth noting that Benetar himself likely doesn't see this positive absence as the pillar propping up his asymmetry argument. I don't think he's being deceptive, hiding some deliberate flaw. Rather, this dependency on an actively appreciated better state in non-existence is probably invisible to him too. His focus on harm prevention blinds him to the logical necessity of this paradoxical valuation, which his argument requires to make non-existence morally superior. GSC reveals what he misses. Without this unseen pillar, his case lacks the force to stand, yet he likely doesn't even know it's there. Not promoting procreation, just showing inescapability. Let me be clear, I'm not here to push anyone to have kids or champion procreation. My focus is solely on showing why, through generic subjective continuity, it's impossible to escape subjective experience. Whether it's in a human, an animal, or an AI, some I will always arise. I do believe it's wrong to bring a child into the world if you know beyond doubt their life will be unrelentingly terrible. Individual cases matter. But Benetar's asymmetry argument isn't about specific lives. It asks us to see each person as a walking embodiment of pain, like the word pain strolling down the street, not as unique individuals with distinct experiences. So, while I agree some births are wrong, Benetar's framework sidesteps particularities, treating all lives as interchangeable units of suffering. That's where GSC steps in, revealing why escaping subjectivity and its pains is futile. Let's tie it all together. What's the final case against Benetar, combining GSC and these logical flaws? The final case is this. Benetar's asymmetry argument, despite its careful structure, collapses under logical scrutiny, and GSC exposes why while highlighting the inescapability of suffering. His key flaw is the positive absence claim, calling the absence of pain good for a non-existent individual. GSC shows there's no I in non-existence to benefit, so his premise is incoherent. Value requires a subject, and without one, his asymmetry lacks normative import. His rhetoric about safeguarding potential individuals relies on a phantom beneficiary, which GSC dismantles by grounding subjectivity in actual conscious systems. Then there's the suffering angle. Operating within Benetar's framework, where each life is a unit of suffering on his grid, GSC reveals that preventing one birth doesn't eliminate subjective awareness or suffering. It just shifts where the I appears. Consciousness is persistent. If it's not one life, it's another, not as a causal chain, but as an inevitable fact. GSC isn't forcing beings into existence. It's describing the reality that subjective awareness keeps arising, making suffering an inescapable part of the deal. Benetar's antinatalism assumes you can opt out of suffering by not procreating. But GSC shows that's impossible as long as consciousness exists. A logical person would see these flaws, no subject in non-existence, no escape from subjectivity, and conclude that Benetar's argument, while thought-provoking, doesn't hold up. GSC just makes the case airtight. That's a wrap on Benetar. His argument's undone by logic, and GSC is the perfect lens to see it. The positive absence is a non-starter, and the inescapability of suffering via persistent subjectivity kills his moral case. I'm sold, and I bet our viewers are too. From the persistent I of subjectivity to Benetar's flawed positive absence and his suffering grid framework, we've shown why antinatalism doesn't stand up to scrutiny. What do you think, folks? Can Benetar's argument be salvaged, or is GSC the final word? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm eager to see your takes. If you love this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more conversations with Ted, Just, and me. Got a topic you want us to tackle next? Suggest it below.